Creating your own library. Well, that seems like a simple enough phrase, and you probably can understand what I mean. Almost immediately, I'm going to go into several reasons why you should create a library, and then right off the top, I'll give you an example and a story from my first several years at coaching at the United States Olympic Education Center. One of the very first staff meetings we had at the USOEC, which also stands for the United States Olympic Education Center, was a meeting of the coaches and the guys that were our bosses, so to speak, the director and the assistant director and the other people that were kind of giving us orders, whatnot, and following, telling us what to do all the time. To make a long story short, it was a coach's presentation on the training plan. Wow. Coach's presentation on the training plan. I had coached probably at that point, let's see, that was 2004, 2005. I had probably been in coaching at the collegiate and the high school and below high school level for about 5 years at that point. So I thought I had a pretty good grasp on training design. When I got to that meeting at the USOEC, or the United States Olympic Education Center, boy, was I in for a surprise. Al Mitchell, who was a two-time Olympic boxing coach and produced several medalists and Olympic champion or two, pulled out this, this form. Several videos ago we talked about periodization, and that is when I got my introduction to periodization. He pulled out these forms and it kind of listed, this is what we're doing here, this is what we're doing there, this is what we're doing there, and this is what we're doing there. This is a guide, he kind of pointed out, and he stressed that over the course of his discussion. This is a guide. It's not written in stone. It's not absolutely everything that I'm going to do, but it guides me throughout the season so I can see where I'm at, and if I feel like I'm out of place, I'll go back to that and look, I am out of place, and here's where I need to go. It was essentially a periodization chart that graphed how many training sessions we're going to do, how many hours of training that we're going to do, how many competitions that we're going to do, the intensity levels and the volumes. That was all brand new to me. So, in about 3 weeks, I was going to have to give a presentation. And I think at that time we had 5 sports. At that time, the USOEC had boxing, weightlifting, Greco-Roman wrestling, women's freestyle wrestling, and I don't know what I left out. Ice skating, and that was for men and women. So each coach over the course of the next, actually we had meetings every 2 weeks, so over the course of the next 10 to 12 weeks, everyone was going to present. So you can imagine the kind of stress that my mind was kind of going through. I was looking at Al Mitchell, the boxing coach, kind of go through his plan, and I'm just like, holy cow, I've never even seen anything like that. I don't even know what this guy's talking about. So that was enlightening. And then I was going to have to present at some point my training plan. And I'm like, wow, I don't have a training plan. I don't know anything about periodization. So that was my first introduction into creating my own library, so to speak. I have several books that I'm going to show you just so you can kind of get the gist of what I'm talking about here. A lot of times what I found is if you can show an image or have a prop, it makes a lot more sense. This is a book specifically for wrestling, National Wrestling Coaches Association Wrestling Coaches Survival Guide. This was one of the first books that I ever got, and it was extremely helpful. I don't know if you could see the size of it. I'll pick it up again. Look at this thing. Literally, it's like 500 pages. So it took me a while to read this thing, probably almost 1.5 years to 2 years. In the time that I was reading it though, man, I got so much information with regard to training plans and practice times and a lot of things that you just think are taken for granted. But in the beginning, like before I actually, went through that presentation with Al Mitchell and read this book a couple times through, I would just run practices based on what I had, studied or learned in the past. You throw a practice together, you say, okay, we're going to work on double legs, okay, we're going to do this, okay, we're going to do that. And then when I was introduced to that, initial coaches staff meeting, and then when I started to read this book, I started to figure out that there is a structure and there is a way that things can be designed so it creates a systematic way of planning and organization. A lot of that I actually learned when I was a health and physical education major at Lockhaven University, but they never really got that deep. I mean, it was enlightening to say the least. Other books that I think are important, specifically for sport, that was a sport specific. This is more of a general book. Sport Physiology for Coaches. I think that's an important one to have. And I guess some people may actually call this the Bible. This is a periodization book. It's the 5th edition. I actually read the 2nd edition. I think it was written in 1999, probably my first year of coaching, 2004, 2005. The original book was written by Tudor Bumpa, and this 5th edition, Periodization Theory of Methodology and Training, is written by Tudor Bumpa and Gregory Half. Again, I'm just kind of pointing out and alluding to the progression that a coach could take if they were trying to figure out how to have a system, an organizational plan that is a little more efficient and effective. Again, the first, several months of my training plan as a, I guess you could call me a novice coach because I hadn't ever been a head coach before, which is a whole other topic. Assistant coach, head coach, man, those are kind of different jobs. When you're the head coach, you're in charge of everything, and everything kind of falls on your shoulders. So that was a different job for me in that sense. Getting back to the whole organization and structure and the system, I just kind of threw practices together, and I wasn't really aware of it at the time until that first meeting, and then those first couple of books. Another book that I think is really important is Enhancing Recovery, and this is a series of articles. The editor is Michael Kelman, and he's probably written 3 or 4 or 5 of the articles in there, and then there's about 20 other authors in the book. The whole idea behind showing you those books is to kind of get you to think about this. There is a way, and then there's a better way. I'll say that again. There is a way, and then there is a better way. So what's the point there? You can do anything, any kind of way you want to, and a lot of times when you start to see how other people are doing it, i.e. Al Mitchell in that example, and then after reading through several of those books, I started to see similarities actually. Even though all 3 of those or 4 of those books were different titles and different subject matter, after reading 3 or 4 or 5 of those type of books, you start to see the structure of each one of those books. You start to see the organizational plan, and you start to notice there are correlations between different books, even though they're different titles. They have a similar structure. Then that started to play around in my mind. I started to think about an organizational systematic plan. Once you have that, that is the foundation of your practices, your training plan, your training design. And then you can take it maybe one step lower. If the athletes see that type of organizational structure, guess what starts to happen to them? They start to feed off of that, efficient and effective way of modeling, and perhaps they start doing their studies like that. Perhaps they start doing their training like that. Perhaps they start to become a little bit more efficient and effective with the way they go about doing their lives. Certainly they'll become that way in practice because that's the way the training design will be. It leads me to another kind of point of discussion here. You probably cannot see these so well, but both of these discs, DVDs, CDs, are training design symposiums from the United States Olympic Education Center via or through the United States Olympic Training Center. In 2007 and 2008, they put together training symposiums, and essentially what it was all of these great authors and great presenters and people that have done a ton of research in sports science theory and all other means by which a coach or an athlete can become good, and they put together a symposium of best practices, and they talked about training design, periodization, recovery, and all those things, some of which I've talked about in some other videos, and it was, to say the least, it wasn't lightning. This was 2007, 2008. This was probably several years after I kind of caught in the bug, so to speak, in terms of trying to figure out a better way that I could design the practices and become a better coach. In that time period, it was like a 3 or 4 year span, they started having these training symposiums, and of course those were lightning. Again, we're talking about building and creating a library for yourself. Of course, there's libraries at your school, there's probably a library in your town, a library at your university. Businesses sometimes will have, what do they call it, continuing education rooms, where essentially all that information in there is to help them do a better job at their business. I'm just going to show you some more things here from the Olympic Training Centers. Psyched at Noon. again, we're talking about creating a library. Psyched at Noon was something that the United States Olympic Training Centers put together. Kirsten Peterson essentially was the head of that, and what it was a bunch of interviews and seminars trying to teach athletes how to become better athletes. And a lot of the interviews dealt with former Olympic medalists and former Olympians and people that had achieved at a high level in sport, so that they could expound and explain what they did on the sports psychology end of things in order to organize their training, what they did with their minds, how they were feeling, so they could feed that information right back to the athletes. A lot of times, in my experience, a coach can say a whole bunch of things, but if a peer says it, there's a lot more, it's more powerful. So I think that those Psyched at Noons were an attempt to get the athletes to see, hey, this person is just like you, and she was able to achieve at a high level, and if you maybe listen to some of the things that she's saying, you can do that too. Again, this is just one example. There's, I have probably 30 or 40 hours of those Psyched at Noons, because until she left, I think she's in Australia now at the Australian Institute of Sport. She probably did that for like 6 years, and I think they did them every week, once a week or something like that. Just want to show you one more type of video. You probably can't see that real well either, but I'll read it to you. Development, Enhancement, and Sustainability of Expert Performance in Sport Conference. Again, this was another seminar or symposium that the United States Olympic Training Center put together. This was also in 2008. So in those 2007 and 2008, they produced a lot of information for anyone, to build a library of information to help them become a better coach, which, by the way, is going to have a byproduct of when you become a better coach, then there's a chance, a high likelihood that your athletes will have a better training system, training design, and ultimately that is going to help them. I think it is important to create your own library, and I just kind of gave you some examples there of why it is important to create your own library. Because in the beginning, if you go back to the beginning of this, I really didn't have any idea of how to create a systematic training plan for the whole year. I was basically just doing practices one a day and then do the next one, the next one. And then, of course, after going through all of that information, once I had created a library, I started to see how these better coaches were organizing their training so each practice fit into the next practice. And over the course of an Olympic quad, man, if you got to think that way. If you have a 15-year-old and you're trying to get that person to be a state champion by the time they're 17 or 18, or if you're going at the Olympic level, if you got a 15-year-old and you want that person to have an opportunity to make the Olympic team when they're 19 or 20, you've got to be thinking 3 and 4 and 5 years and ahead. Well, how do you learn all of that material? Where do you get that information from? Do you just put one practice together after the other after the other? You could do that, and it may or may not work. You'll find out a lot of times, as in anything in life, by trial and error. And what I've figured out in my life is, a lot of people have already done some of the things that I'm already doing, and that was my believe me, that was my first clue when I stepped into that Olympic education coaches staff meeting. I'm like, whoa, that was it was mind-boggling to me. Then I started to create my own library, and then I started to find out several hundred coaches have done the same thing. In fact, since the 50s and the 60s, the Europeans were doing that, and that goes back to the talk we had about periodization. And a lot of this stuff does come from the Eastern Europeans, the Soviet bloc nations from the 50s and the 60s, and then, of course, to where we are right now. So I hope that information was a little bit helpful for you. And I encourage you, and I want you to think about creating a library for yourself. When you do that, you are at the cutting edge of all of the information that is coming out in your sport and in life in general. If you believe that that's possible, if you believe that you can stay at the cutting edge, it will be very difficult for the competition to pass you. Now, of course, I'm mainly talking about sport, but that's a kind of a life skill too. If you're in business, in any type of business, if you continue to educate yourself and continue the learning process, it's going to be very difficult for businesses to pass you. Because bring it back to sport and bring it back to education again, it's the same thing. I think all three are the same. Once you develop a dynamic ability to learn, it can become contagious. When it becomes contagious and you see the so-called outcomes of the results, now you'll want to do even more of it. Just as one more thing to think about, it can become overwhelming if you make it overwhelming. Right? What I learned in most of those things that I read was there's a time and a place for everything, and there needs to be some balance, and there has to be a structure. In high school and in college, And you know, when I was in college, they teach you how to create a lesson plan. Essentially, when students or athletes or even yourself, you can create a lesson plan for yourself. That way, you've got a timeline of events that you actually want to go through, so that you've got an organized, systematic structure and a way of doing things, so you don't feel overwhelmed by all this material. You're not going to be able to read everything under the sun, but it is important for you to create your own library. Well, I guess I have one more piece of information. You also can study books like that, and that's mainly training type of theory, sports psychology, I think, psychology, I think, psychiatry, I think, controlling your emotions. I think those books are, you know, very important too. Most of that stuff I showed you there was X's and O's, although some of those symposiums, you know, they had sports psychologists talking about different things. I think it is also important to create a library of motivational speakers, sports psychology books, psychology books, emotional control books. Because what I've learned in my short span in coaching is the relationships that you build with the athlete, and how, and the ways and the means that you communicate to them becomes extremely important. If you build a library of all of those type of books, you will be better served. One more story, I think I might have alluded to this a while ago in one of the other videos, I can't remember which one it was, but my first several years in coaching, we had great results, but the team hated me. Because again, I was coming from a boys, men's background of coaching, and the communication style is different, the listening skills are different, a lot of things are different when you change genders. Is one better than the other? That's not what I'm saying. I'm simply suggesting that we had very good results and the team hated me and they couldn't stand me, they wanted to get rid of me. After I learned how to coach women through understanding the process of how to teach and coach to women, as a byproduct of reading all these different materials, and it dawned on me, like, wow, you know what, there is a difference. But until that time, that hit me right in the face. And then when I actually started to create my own library and study all the materials in there, I decided, based on what the athletes were telling me, and USA Wrestling was telling me, that creating a library is more helpful than just the X's and O's. It also got me to start to read all of those books I mentioned that kind of dealt with the mind and building better relationships. And I think that was that can be a key to everyone's success. Creating your own library. Remember, you can find out more information like this at youtube.com, Coach Shannon. Coach Shannon Talks.